What if a young boy born in a rural village could grow up to change the course of history for an entire nation? What if the path to greatness began with herding cattle and listening to the elders speak beneath the stars? In the rolling hills of South Africa's Eastern Cape, far from the noise of politics or cities, a boy named Raleigh Mandela was born in 1918. His first name, Raleigh, meant pulling the branch of a tree, but in the local language it also implied troublemaker. Little did anyone know this boy, so full of questions and curiosity, would one day trouble an entire system built on injustice. He was born in the village of Mvizo, part of the Thembu tribe, and from the start his life was shaped by the traditions of his people. After his father's dispute with a local magistrate, the family moved to a nearby village called Quinu, where Mandela spent most of his childhood. There, he ran through the fields barefoot, swam in muddy rivers, and played games with other boys from the village, games that mimicked the bravery of warriors. Mandela's father, Gadla Henry Mfakaniaswa, was a local chief and counselor to the Thembu royal family. He raised Mandela with a strong sense of justice, pride, and identity. When Mandela was just 9 years old, his father passed away. This loss would change his life dramatically, sending him down a new and unexpected path. After his father's death, Mandela was placed under the care of Chief Jongintaba Dalindiebo, the acting regent of the Thembu nation. This move was not just a matter of guardianship. It was a shift into a new world, one filled with leadership, tradition, and the responsibilities of a royal household. In the royal kraal, Mandela was exposed to the courtly rituals of governance and tribal meetings. He watched as disputes were settled not with violence, but through long discussions that valued fairness and collective agreement. He was fascinated by these meetings, often sitting quietly in the background, soaking in the wisdom of the elders. From these moments, he began to understand what it meant to be a leader, not through power, but through service. Mandela attended a local mission school, where he was given the English name Nelson by one of his teachers, a common practice under British colonial influence. It was the first sign that his life would exist between two worlds, the traditions of his people and the forces of a colonial system. Education became a key part of Mandela's early life, not just because he wanted to succeed, but because he believed knowledge was a path to freedom. He moved from the small village school to Healdtown, a Wesleyan college, and later to Fort Hare University, one of the few higher education institutions for Black South Africans at the time. At Fort Hare, Mandela began to find his voice. He was active in student politics and became involved in a boycott against university policies. When he refused to back down, the university suspended him, forcing him to leave before completing his degree. This moment was a clear sign of his growing determination to stand up for what he believed in, even when it came at a personal cost. Back at home, the regent was disappointed. He had plans for Mandela to marry and settle down, following the traditional path expected of young men. But Mandela had a different idea. Unwilling to accept a future chosen for him, he ran away to Johannesburg, the bustling industrial heart of South Africa. It was here that Mandela's real transformation began. He arrived in the city with little more than determination, taking a job as a night watchman and later working at a law firm as a clerk. Johannesburg was a world apart from the rural hills of Quinu. The city was shaped by harsh laws, deep inequality, and the ever-present force of apartheid, the legal system designed to keep races separate and white supremacy in place. Mandela was not blind to what he saw. He felt the sting of racial discrimination in the simplest of things, being told where he could live, whom he could speak to, and what he could aspire to. It was in this environment that Mandela met Walter Sisulu, a key figure in the African National Congress. Sisulu became a mentor to Mandela, introducing him to people who were actively resisting apartheid, including Oliver Tambo. For the first time, Mandela saw a path forward, not just for himself, but for his people. He enrolled at the University of Witwatersrand to study law, becoming one of the few black students in a predominantly white institution. While studying, he also began to attend political meetings, gatherings that spoke openly of freedom, dignity, and equality. Mandela was drawn to the idea that the law, so often used to oppress, could also be used to liberate. He started to believe in the power of organized action. The more he listened, the more he read, and the more he spoke with others, the clearer his purpose became. He was no longer the curious boy from Quinu watching elders in silence. He was becoming a man with a mission, to challenge the very system that sought to control his destiny. As he walked the crowded streets of Johannesburg, Mandela carried the memories of his village, the wisdom of tribal leaders, and the strength of a father who had once stood tall against injustice. His past was not a burden, it was his foundation. And from that foundation, Nelson Mandela would begin his rise, not to power, but to purpose. The life of a boy from the hills of the Eastern Cape was now merging with the storm of resistance brewing across South Africa. In the shadow of gold mines and concrete towers, a future freedom fighter was beginning to find his place. The road ahead would be long, filled with sacrifice, struggle, and unimaginable hardship. But for Nelson Mandela, the journey had truly begun. By the late 1940s, Nelson Mandela was no longer an observer of change. He was one of its catalysts. The young law student who had once arrived in Johannesburg with nothing was now a rising figure in a growing movement against apartheid. Apartheid was more than just a system. It was a daily reality, a cruel design that divided every part of life by race. Where people could live, work, learn, and love was determined by the color of their skin. And in this system, Mandela found his greatest enemy. Alongside Walter Sisulu and Oliver Tambo, Mandela helped transform the African National Congress, or ANC, from a cautious organization into a powerful force for resistance. They were young, educated, and driven. They knew the old strategies of petitions and polite appeals were not enough. They wanted direct action. In 1944, Mandela co-founded the ANC Youth League. Its mission was simple: to shake the foundations of white supremacy. Through boycotts, strikes, and civil disobedience, they aimed to challenge the government not just with words but with deeds. By 1952, Mandela was leading the Defiance Campaign, the first large-scale, multiracial political protest against apartheid laws. Thousands of volunteers deliberately broke unjust laws. They entered areas marked whites only, refused to carry pass books, and faced arrest without fear. Mandela traveled the country to rally support, giving speeches that inspired courage and defiance. He urged people not to hate but to rise. He preached discipline, dignity, and unity. For his role in organizing the campaign, Mandela was arrested and sentenced to 9 months of hard labor, suspended for 2 years. But the government had begun to take notice. Mandela was now on their radar. During this period, he also co-founded South Africa's first black law firm with Oliver Tambo. They offered legal aid to those who had none, people arrested under apartheid laws, those evicted from their homes, and workers dismissed unfairly. Justice, to Mandela, was not a theory. It was something people deserved in real life. While Mandela fought for others, his personal life was also changing. He had married Evelyn Mace, a nurse in the mid-1940s, and together they had 4 children. But the long hours, constant activism, and growing pressure placed a heavy burden on their marriage. Eventually, the two separated. Later, Mandela would meet and marry Winnie Madikizela, a social worker who shared his passion for justice and resistance. Winnie would become a powerful figure in her own right, especially during Mandela's years of imprisonment. In 1955, a new vision emerged, a blueprint for a democratic South Africa. It was called the Freedom Charter. Written by a coalition of anti-apartheid groups, the charter declared that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white. It called for equality, land redistribution, education, and human rights. The apartheid government saw it as an act of treason. They responded with force. Mandela and 155 others were arrested and charged with treason in a trial that dragged on for years. It was an attempt to crush the movement by tying up its leaders in endless court proceedings. But Mandela did not break. In the courtroom, he remained calm and eloquent, turning his defense into a platform to expose apartheid's cruelty. By the end of the trial in 1961, all charges were dropped. But the system Mandela fought was only growing more brutal. Peaceful protest was met with bullets, most horrifyingly during the Sharpeville massacre in 1960, when police opened fire on unarmed demonstrators, killing 69 people. The world began to take notice. Protests erupted across Europe and the Americas. International newspapers printed stories of South African injustice. Mandela understood this was a turning point. The ANC was banned. Its leaders were hunted. Mandela went underground, adopting disguises and moving secretly to avoid arrest. He earned the nickname the Black Pimpernel for his ability to evade capture. During this time, he traveled across Africa and even to the United Kingdom, seeking support and learning from liberation movements in other nations. He met with leaders, studied military tactics, and gained a wider understanding of global politics. When he returned to South Africa, he made a dramatic decision. Mandela, once a firm believer in nonviolence, helped form Umkhonto we Sizwe, the armed wing of the ANC. He believed the time had come for a different kind of resistance, one that could not be ignored. Umkhonto we Sizwe, meaning Spear of the Nation, began to carry out acts of sabotage, targeting infrastructure, not people, to disrupt the apartheid government. Mandela explained that their aim was not to kill, but to make the country ungovernable. For Mandela, this shift was painful but necessary. He knew it would make him a target. He knew it might cost him his freedom. In 1962, Mandela was captured by police. It was a betrayal, perhaps by an informant, that led to his arrest. He was charged with leaving the country illegally and inciting workers to strike. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison. But while he was already serving that sentence, authorities uncovered more. Documents were found at a farm in Rivonia that linked Mandela and others to the armed resistance. Now he and his comrades faced charges of sabotage and conspiracy to overthrow the government. It was a capital offense. At the Rivonia trial, Mandela stood in the dock, calm and unshaken. In what became one of the most famous speeches of the 20th century, he explained why he had taken up arms. "I have fought against white domination, and I have fought against black domination. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal for which I am prepared to die." His words echoed around the world. The court did not sentence him to death, but to life in prison. He was sent to Robben Island, a bleak, windswept place off the coast of Cape Town. It would become his home for the next 18 years, the first chapter in nearly 3 decades of imprisonment. The government hoped to silence him, but Nelson Mandela's voice had already become too powerful to contain. Robben Island was not just a prison. It was a place designed to break the human spirit. Cold winds lashed the rocky shore, and the sun beat down mercilessly on the lime quarry where prisoners were forced to work. Nelson Mandela, labeled prisoner number 46664, meaning the 466th prisoner in the year 1964, was locked in a small cell with nothing but a mat on the floor, a bucket, and a tiny window no bigger than a brick. Each morning began with the harsh sound of a whistle. Prisoners were lined up and counted, then marched out to labor. Mandela, like others, dug and broke rocks under the blinding sun. The dust from the lime quarry damaged his eyesight, a wound he would carry for life. But the authorities did not understand one thing. While they tried to crush Mandela's body, they only strengthened his resolve. Inside the prison, he created a new battlefield, one of patience, dignity, and strategy. Mandela insisted that even as prisoners, they deserved to be treated as human beings. He led protests against poor food, inadequate clothing, and the denial of basic rights. He studied the prison system carefully, finding ways to challenge it from within. Even behind bars, he remained a leader. Younger inmates looked to him for guidance. He taught them history, politics, and the values of non-racial democracy. They called the prison their university, and Mandela was its quiet, commanding professor. Books were smuggled in. Pages were shared secretly. Education became their weapon. Outside the prison walls, the world was changing. Protests grew louder. The international community began to demand Mandela's release. His name, once hidden, was now spoken in parliaments, schools, and churches across the globe. Songs were written about him. Demonstrations were held in his honor. Free Nelson Mandela became a chant for freedom itself. Yet inside, Mandela remained calm. He did not beg for release. He believed in principle over comfort, in patience over rage. He He stayed on Robben Island for 18 long years. In 1982, he was transferred to Palsmore Prison and later to Victor Verster Prison, where conditions improved slightly. But freedom still seemed far away. During these years, Mandela kept his mind sharp. He continued to study, to write, and to think about the future of South Africa. He began to understand that liberation would require more than resistance. It would demand reconciliation. Secret talks began between Mandela and representatives of the apartheid government. At first, they were cautious, even hostile. But Mandela knew that peace had to begin with dialogue. He spoke not with bitterness, but with clarity. He made it clear that his struggle was not against whites, but against the system of apartheid. He was willing to forgive, but not to forget. Over time, his moral authority became undeniable. Even his jailers began to respect him. He was no longer just a prisoner. He was a symbol. As South Africa erupted into violence and international pressure mounted, President F.W. de Klerk recognized that the old system could not survive. On February 2, 1990, de Klerk announced the unbanning of the ANC and the release of Nelson Mandela. 9 days later, after 27 years in prison, Mandela walked free. The world watched as he emerged from Victor Verster Prison, hand in hand with Winnie Mandela, his fist raised in triumph. His hair was gray, his face lined with time, but his spirit was unbroken. He spoke to the people not with vengeance, but with vision. He called for peace, for unity, for democracy. "I stand here before you not as a prophet, but as a humble servant of you, the people," he declared. "Your tireless and heroic sacrifices have made it possible for me to be here today. I therefore place the remaining years of my life in your hands." South Africa was at a crossroads. The years of pain had left deep scars. But Mandela refused to let anger shape the future. He returned to lead the ANC, negotiating with the government for a peaceful transition. These talks were difficult, often on the brink of collapse. Violence erupted across the country. Political killings and ethnic clashes threatened to destroy the fragile hope. Yet Mandela remained steady. He visited grieving families. He calmed angry crowds. He made personal appeals for peace. His greatest achievement during this time was not a speech or a law, but his ability to forgive. He reached out to his former enemies, inviting them to be part of a new South Africa. He met with generals, ministers, even former prison officials. He believed in building, not in burning. As negotiations moved forward, a date was finally set. In April 1994, South Africa would hold its first fully democratic election. For the first time in its history, every adult, black, white, Indian, or mixed race would have the right to vote. Mandela campaigned not with promises of revenge, but with promises of hope. His message was simple: one person, one vote. A rainbow nation united in its diversity. On April 27, 1994, millions lined up at polling stations. Some waited all day and night to cast their ballot. Tears flowed freely. Songs of joy filled the air. When the votes were counted, the result was clear. Nelson Mandela had been elected president. The boy from Quenu, the prisoner from Robben Island, was now the leader of a free nation. And as he stood before the world on May 10, 1994, taking the oath of office in Pretoria, he said, "Never, never, and never again shall it be that this beautiful land will again experience the oppression of one by another." The long walk to freedom was not yet over, but it had reached a mountaintop. Nelson Mandela entered the presidency not with vengeance, but with vision. South Africa was no longer in chains, but its wounds were deep, and its people divided by centuries of injustice. Mandela understood that leading a nation through transformation would be harder than leading a revolution. Freedom had been won, but peace was still fragile. His mission was to unify a country long torn apart by fear, hatred, and inequality. One of his first acts as president was to establish the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, led by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Its purpose was not to punish, but to uncover the truth of apartheid's horrors. Victims came forward to tell their stories. Perpetrators were invited to confess their crimes in exchange for amnesty. The world watched, stunned. Instead of courtrooms filled with revenge, there were tears, confessions, and sometimes forgiveness. Mandela believed that a nation could not heal without confronting its past. He also made bold gestures of unity. In 1995, South Africa was set to host the Rugby World Cup. Rugby had long been seen as a sport of the white minority. Many black South Africans viewed it as a symbol of apartheid. But Mandela saw an opportunity. He supported the national team, the Springboks, and wore their jersey at the final match. When South Africa won, the image of Mandela in green and gold, raising the trophy with the white captain Francois Pienaar, stunned the world. It wasn't just a sports victory. It was a powerful message. We are one nation, one people, one future. Mandela's leadership style was defined by empathy. He listened carefully, spoke gently, and led firmly. He welcomed those who had once oppressed him into government roles. He made room for differences without abandoning justice. Internationally, Mandela re-established South Africa as a respected member of the global community. Sanctions were lifted. Trade resumed. World leaders who had once turned away now welcomed him with open arms. Despite this global admiration, Mandela's presidency was not without challenges. The economy was struggling. Unemployment remained high. Many black South Africans still lived in poverty, their hopes of immediate change unmet. Mandela acknowledged these challenges openly. He knew that one term would not fix centuries of injustice. But he planted seeds for future growth, investing in education, housing, and health care. He also strengthened South Africa's new democratic institutions. A new constitution was adopted in 1996, hailed as one of the most progressive in the world. It enshrined equality, human rights, and freedom for all. And yet Mandela made a decision that shocked many. He would serve only one term. He could have stayed in power. He had the love of the people, the support of his party, and the admiration of the world. But Mandela believed that leadership was not about clinging to power. It was about serving with integrity, then stepping aside. In 1999, he handed over the presidency to his deputy, Thabo Mbeki. Mandela retired from politics, but not from public life. He turned his attention to global causes: HIV/AIDS awareness, peace building, and education. Through the Nelson Mandela Foundation, he supported projects that empowered young people and fought poverty. His voice remained influential. World leaders sought his counsel. Young activists looked to him for inspiration. Wherever he went, he carried a quiet dignity that moved people, not through force, but through example. But Mandela also faced personal heartache. His marriage to Winnie ended in divorce. He lost friends and comrades along the way, and he carried the weight of a nation's expectations. Yet he never stopped smiling, never stopped hoping. He often said, "The greatest glory in living lies not in never falling, but in rising every time we fall." Mandela had fallen many times, into grief, into prison, into hardship. But he had always risen, stronger, wiser, and more determined. He became a symbol far larger than a politician. He was a father figure, a moral compass, a global icon of justice and forgiveness. And though he had stepped away from power, his influence remained in every corner of South Africa, in the classrooms where children of all races studied together, in the parliament where every voice had the right to speak, and in the streets where people walked without fear. The nation he led was not perfect. Inequality remained. Violence still erupted. Corruption emerged in places he had tried to clean, but Mandela had changed the soul of the country. He had taught his people to dream, not only of freedom but of fairness, not only of peace but of possibility. Mandela once said, "It always seems impossible until it's done." Through his presidency, he proved that even the deepest wounds can begin to heal, that even a nation shattered by hate can choose to rebuild on the foundation of hope. He left office not as a ruler, but as a beloved elder. And South Africa, though still on its journey, walked forward with the light he had lit. After stepping down from the presidency, Nelson Mandela could have quietly faded into private life. He had done more than most ever dream of. He had spent nearly 3 decades in prison, led a country out of darkness, and become president. But retirement was never his plan. Mandela believed his work was far from over. He had walked free, but millions were still trapped by poverty, disease, inequality, and injustice. He devoted his remaining years to being a voice for those who could not speak for themselves. He founded the Nelson Mandela Foundation, focusing on education, social justice, and public dialogue. It became a platform for change, a home for ideas that could challenge old systems and inspire new generations. One of Mandela's most urgent causes in his post-presidency years was the fight against HIV and AIDS. The disease was spreading rapidly across South Africa, and yet it remained a taboo subject. Mandela broke that silence. In 2005, he made a deeply personal announcement. His own son, Magatho, had died of AIDS-related illness. By speaking openly, Mandela shattered the stigma that surrounded the disease. He urged the world to act with compassion and speed. He called for better education, access to treatment, and honest leadership. His voice helped shift the global conversation, turning shame into awareness. Mandela's post-presidency years were marked by global travel. He met with world leaders, spoke at major events, and received countless honors. He became a symbol of reconciliation, not just for South Africa, but for all of humanity. In 2007, at the age of 89, Mandela launched the Elders, a group of global leaders brought together to tackle the world's most difficult challenges, from climate change to conflict resolution. Among its members were figures like Kofi Annan, Jimmy Carter, and Mary Robinson. Mandela believed in the wisdom of age, the power of experience, and the importance of moral leadership. The Elders worked behind the scenes, using diplomacy and dialogue to promote peace. Despite his global fame, Mandela never lost his humility. He often said he was not a saint, unless a saint was a sinner who kept on trying. He laughed easily, joked with children, and reminded people that true leadership came from listening. As he aged, Mandela gradually withdrew from public life. He returned to Kwanu, the village of his childhood, where he spent more time with his family. But even in those quieter years, his presence remained powerful. He was honored with statues, awards, and international days in his name. July 18, his birthday, was declared Nelson Mandela International Day by the United Nations, a call to dedicate 67 minutes of service, one for each year he spent serving others. Mandela's health declined in his final years. He was hospitalized several times, and each time the world held its breath. South Africans lit candles, sang songs, and prayed. They were not ready to say goodbye. On December 5, 2013, Nelson Mandela passed away at the age of 95. The announcement was met with sorrow, silence, and song. Streets filled with mourners. Tributes came from every corner of the globe. Leaders across the world, from presidents to pop stars, paused to remember him. In South Africa, a period of national mourning began. People laid flowers, lit candles, and gathered in parks and churches to celebrate his life. His memorial service was attended by more than 90 heads of state. It was one of the largest gatherings of world leaders in history, a reflection of how one man had touched so many lives. But Mandela's true legacy was not in the honors or the headlines. It lived in the values he stood for: justice, dignity, forgiveness, and courage. It lived in the classrooms built through his foundation, in the communities lifted out of poverty, in the conversations between people who had once been divided. Mandela showed the world that one person, with a steady heart and a clear purpose, could help bend the arc of history. He believed that no one is born hating another person, that if people can learn to hate, they can be taught to love. His story did not end with his death. It lives on in the lives he changed, the policies he shaped, and the hearts he opened. In South Africa, his name is spoken with reverence. Children learn about him not as a distant figure, but as a grandfather of the nation. His image appears on currency, on murals, in songs. Across the world, he remains a symbol of what is possible: a prisoner who became a president, a revolutionary who became a reconciler, a man who chose peace over revenge. And in every corner of the globe where people rise up for justice, his spirit echoes. Nelson Mandela once said, "What counts in life is not the mere fact that we have lived. It is what difference we have made to the lives of others that will determine the significance of the life we lead." By that measure, his life was one of the most significant of our time. Nelson Mandela's journey did not end with his passing. In many ways, it had only just begun. His life became a blueprint, not only for leaders, but for everyday people seeking courage in the face of fear and hope in the shadow of despair. His legacy lives in classrooms where children read his speeches and write essays about justice. It lives in communities working to bridge racial divides, and in movements demanding freedom, dignity, and democracy. Mandela's image has become more than just a symbol. It is a mirror held up to the world, asking each of us, what will you stand for? What will you sacrifice for peace? His story teaches that transformation does not happen overnight. That real change requires patience, persistence, and a willingness to listen. Mandela spent 27 years in prison not because he loved struggle, but because he understood that freedom without justice is just another form of captivity. He reminds us that forgiveness is not weakness, that shaking hands with your enemy takes more strength than raising a fist, that reconciliation is not forgetting the past, but refusing to let it poison the future. In today's world, where new forms of division continue to emerge, Mandela's voice still speaks with clarity. He challenges us to lead with empathy, to speak truth without hate, to believe that no one is beyond redemption. Each year on Mandela Day, people around the world are asked to give 67 minutes of service, 1 minute for every year Mandela devoted to public service. But his legacy cannot be measured in minutes. It is measured in lives touched, minds changed, and communities transformed. Universities bear his name. Statues of him stand in cities across continents. Streets and buildings carry his legacy into everyday life. Yet the most powerful monument to Nelson Mandela is not made of stone or bronze. It is the idea that a better world is always possible. His impact also lives in leaders he inspired. Barack Obama, the first black president of the United States, often cited Mandela as one of his heroes. In countries around the world, those fighting against oppression still turn to Mandela's words for strength. He did not pretend to be perfect. He often spoke of his flaws, of moments of doubt and failure, but he never let those flaws define him. That, too, is part of his message. Greatness is not born, it is built, in silence, in struggle, and in service. Mandela's story has been told in books, films, museums, and murals, but perhaps it is best told in the actions of people who continue his work. Teachers in overcrowded schools, activists marching for justice, doctors treating the sick in underserved communities. Each act of compassion, each step toward equality, adds a line to the story he began. As generations move forward, Mandela remains a guide. For those born after apartheid, he is a connection to a painful past and a promise that their future can be different. For those who lived through it, he is a reminder of what was endured and what was overcome. Mandela often said, "I am not a liberator. Liberators do not exist. The people liberate themselves." He saw himself not as a savior, but as a servant. And in that humility, he became immortal. Today, the challenges facing the world are immense: climate crisis, inequality, war, displacement. But so too is the potential for unity, for justice, for renewal. If Mandela taught us anything, it is that no system is too strong to challenge, no prison too fortified to escape, no hate so deep it cannot be undone by love, and so his story continues. Not as a chapter in a history book, but as a living call to action. A quiet voice that asks each of us to look around, to step forward, and to build something better. Because in the end, the true measure of Mandela's life is not how high he rose, but how deeply he lifted others. Nelson Mandela walked the long road to freedom so others could walk beside him. And now, it is our turn to carry the torch. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the extraordinary life of Nelson Mandela. His story is not just a lesson in history. It is a reminder of what it means to stand for something greater than yourself. If his life moved you, inspired you, or made you reflect, then let it also move you to action. Whether it's treating others with dignity, standing up for justice, or simply listening with empathy, you too can carry his legacy forward. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, share it with someone who needs inspiration today, and subscribe to Lang Fac for more powerful stories that teach not just English, but courage, character, and connection. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story that speaks to the heart and sharpens the mind. And as you go about your day, remember Mandela's words. It always seems impossible until it's done. Thanks for watching, and keep learning, keep growing, and keep believing in a better world.